I have had, I can't tell you how many, I'm not even going to guess how many emails since November 10th, since yesterday, or really earlier in the day on the 9th, I guess, when this first went up on the website, Paul Krugman's piece, Franklin Delano Obama, and in which he mentions, the basic premise of it, first of all, is that FDR was not aggressive enough with the New Deal. And he quotes MIT economist E. Carey Brown saying the fiscal stimulus was unsuccessful not because it doesn't work, because it wasn't tried. In other words, FDR wasn't enough of a Keynesian. But anyhow, there's this one line in here that Paul Krugman drops in that says, what saved the economy and the New Deal was the enormous public works project known as World War II, which finally provided a fiscal stimulus adequate to the economy's needs. I beg to differ. This is such conventional wisdom, and it has been promoted by Republicans since 1952. But the fact of the matter is that, A, we were coming out of the Great Depression. In fact, if you go back and if you pick up a copy, and I was looking around for mine over the weekend, I couldn't find it. I've got to order another one. My dad gave me this as a gift before he died, a couple of years before he died. It's called The Illustrious Dunderheads by Rex Stout. Rex Stout, who invented Nero Wolfe, the Nero Wolfe character, the famous detective. Over 70 million of the Nero Wolfe books were in print in the 70s or the 80s, whenever it was that Nero Wolfe finally died. And God only knows how many there are now. And the one piece of nonfiction that Rex Stout ever wrote, during World War II, he was very active. He dramatically slowed down his writing, his fiction writing, and went to work on the war propaganda board. There was some name for it that something close to that. And one of the things that he did during this time was he compiled speeches on the floor of the House and the Senate by mostly Republicans. There were a few Democrats, but it was probably 90% Republicans, who were speaking out against the United States entering World War II. Most of them in the 6 months or the year leading up to Pearl Harbor, when the war in Europe was really, really nasty, and there was evidence of the Holocaust happening and just the whole thing, or the early stages of it, and yet these Republicans kept coming on the floor of the House and the Senate saying we shouldn't go to war. Why? Because the economy was starting to pick up steam throughout the late 30s, and they were suggesting correctly that if we went to war, it would slow down economic growth in the United States. And in fact, it did. And let me just give you the evidence of that. And I just, I think it's so important to just push back on these myths, because what happened was after the war, then economic growth really started at the end of World War II. And that is when the Republicans then in the late 40s, or throughout the 40s and into the early 50s, Republicans started this mantra of, well, the only thing that got us out of World War II wasn't the New Deal. We need to do away with the New Deal. I mean, the New Deal is not a good thing at all. We need to get rid of the New Deal, in fact. And instead, they were saying, well, what got us out of the Great Depression instead of the New Deal was World War II, and it's just not the case. I mean, this Limbaugh even continues this mantra to this day.
Roosevelt is dead. His policies may live on, but we're in the process of doing something about that as well.
So a number of real serious scholars, as opposed to, first of all, economics is an art and not a science to a large extent. When it referred to as a science, the dismal science, if you want 15 different opinions, all you have to do is solicit 15 different economists. There are very few absolutes in the world of economics, but there are some absolutes in the world of history. So let's just, back this up a little bit. Joseph Cullen and Price Fishback, and there's a number of papers on this about the Great Depression. But this is just a classic article on this. The article, it's the NBER Working Paper Series. The NBER is the National Bureau of Economic Research out of Cambridge, Massachusetts. This was published in December of 2006, by the way. This is relatively recent. Cullen and Fishback. The title is, Did Big Government's Largesse Help the Locals? The Implications of World War II Spending for Local Economic Activity, 1939 to 1958. And the question that they lay out, and they lay it out, pretty straightforward. They come right out and they say, did World War II get us out of the Great Depression? At its peak in 1944, for example, they point out military spending accounted for over 40% of GDP. And by 1950, it was only 5%. So, you'd think that would have tremendous stimulation. Connecticut and Michigan, for example, had the greatest per capita war spending, over $10,000 per person. Didn't that stimulate the economy? No. In Connecticut and Michigan, with the greatest per capita war spending at over $10,000 per person, their growth rates in retail sales were in the lower part of the state distribution. In other words, the states that got the most World War II money actually saw the slowest economic growth. They say the natural expectation is that the introduction of World War II contracts and facility spending during World War would have led to expansions in the local economies that might have carried over after the war and led to faster growth the entire decade of the 40s. In late 1940, the unemployment rate was still hovering around 10%. So it would appear that the war helped soak up some on. Well, if you ship everybody off to war, that's going to do that. It's going to look like you have full employment. But they said an additional dollar of New Deal public works and relief spending between 33 and 39 led to an increase in retail sales of roughly 43 cents in retail sales per capita in 1939. And that can be translated into an expansion overall of 80 cents by 1939. But they point out that the war contracts had a more powerful crowding out effect than even FDR's spending in terms of actually reducing consumer demand. They point out because privately owned plants that normally produce autos, clothing, and consumer goods were converted to producing military equipment. This led to sharp declines in the productions of many consumer goods and added costs of recovering from consumer to military production at the beginning of the war and then conversion back after the war. So, in fact, here's perhaps a better summary of it. They say, we examine whether local economies that were the centers of federal spending on military mobilization experienced more rapid growth in consumer economic activity than other areas. We've combined information from a wide, they look through all these 39 to 48, 39 to 54, 39 to 58, federal war spending per capita. Several factors contributed to the relative lack of impact. World War II spending often required a conversion of plants designed for civilian good production into military factories and back again over a 9-year period. Finally, less of the military spending was earmarked for wages and locally produced products. So this is World War II actually put the brakes on the recovery, slowed down the recovery that was seriously beginning in 37, 38, and 39. And it's such a shame that conventional wisdom has been reinvented to a large extent to suggest otherwise. Econ Browser, the New Deal and the Great Depression. There's a very good analysis here. I could get terribly wonky about this. But for example, the results for 1949 suggest that any positive effect on savings had gone away from World War II, had gone away by the end of the decade. 0.04 standard deviations. War spending increased bonds slightly, but that was about it. There was very little, I'm reading from the study, there's very little change in the impact of war spending on annual earnings and labor productivity within manufacturing. The one standard deviation effects are less than 0.025% in either case. Bottom line, the war did not stimulate the economy. In fact, it slowed it down.